Hi, welcome everyone. We're going to give folks just a few minutes to pop into the room here. And as we're getting started, I'd like to just say hello again. And my name is Janine LaPrade, and I serve as the Managing Director of the Policy and Research team here at the National Skills Coalition. And we'd love to invite you all to introduce yourselves by putting your name, the organization you work with, and the state you're joining us from in the chat. All right, so as folks are doing that, I'm also going to just say that my colleague Rachel Vilsack and I are pleased to have so many of you joining us today. To get us started here, I'm going to just provide a little bit of context to help set the stage for this panel discussion, and then I'm going to turn it over to Rachel. So as many of you know, in 2020, the National Skills Coalition released its Skills for an Inclusive Economic Recovery framework. And in this framework, we outlined several different policies and ways that we as policymakers, leaders, and practitioners in the field of workforce development and post-secondary education can support workers in equitably participating in and benefiting from the economy's restructuring. Here at NSC, these policies are guiding our work at the federal and state level to advance racial equity and to continue to try to center those most impacted by the pandemic recession and those who have been previously held back by structural barriers of discrimination or lack of opportunity. As we know from the work that many of you are doing, non-degree credentials, such as certificates, industry certifications, and occupational licenses have become essential to meeting the educational and economic mobility goals for many students and working learners. NSC has been working for the past few years with several states to develop criteria to assess the quality of these non-degree credentials and to ensure that related funding and policy decisions really do help advance equity and put learners on a path to success. From this work that you all are doing, we also know how important it is for states and local leaders to really also focus on systems change. And especially as it relates to looking at different policies, practices, and processes that we know need to shift in order to help working learners really meet both their educational and their economic goals. For NSC, this means including in our work staff, partners, and stakeholders that reflect a diversity of racial and ethnic identities, and finding new ways to engage many more different voices in the design of these policies and programs. While the composition of our panel today may not fully reflect this commitment, we have invited leaders to join us who are working in partnership with others in their states to close the equity gap and really focus on student success and outcomes. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, who's going to take us a little deeper into the role of equity in advancing these non-degree credential policies and practices in states.
Thank you, Janine. It's really great to be here. Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Vilsack. I'm a senior fellow at National Skills Coalition.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Vilsack. I'm a senior fellow at National Skills Coalition.
Haley, I'm getting a little bit of audio feedback here for folks.
Haley, I'm getting a little bit of audio feedback here for folks that.
You should be good now, Rachel.
Okay, thank you, Haley. Haley, if you go to the next slide, as Janine mentioned, post-secondary education and skills training has really become essential to the nation's economic mobility and growth. More than 80% of all jobs in today's economy require some form of education or training beyond high school. And before the pandemic, virtually all new jobs created since the last economic recession went to workers with at least some post-secondary education. Non-degree credentials, such as certificates, industry certifications, apprenticeship certificates, and occupational licenses, are a growing segment of the education marketplace, especially for learners of color. In 2018, consider that 44% of community college credentials awarded were non-degree certificates, with 1 in 4 training programs lasting less than 1 year in length. Students of color are more likely than whites to report certificates as their highest level of education, which reflects to a degree systemic tracking that has occurred, which placed students of color into pathways that do not pay off as significantly, as well as inequities in access to more advanced education. We have an economic imperative to dismantle structural racism within workforce education and training systems that hold workers back from their employment and earnings goals and our economy from achieving an inclusive recovery. Defining quality credentials, pathways to education and career advancement, and equity go hand in hand in this work that we do. On the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit more about how we view defining quality in the non-degree credential space. We know that jobs in the labor market have changed dramatically since the pandemic. There are still millions of workers who need access and support to upgrade their skills in order to find work in this new economy. Many workers of color, women, and long-term unemployed are already enrolling and finding pathways to skills training programs because they see these short-term options as a flexible and achievable pathway to the technical skills they need to find a better career. States, systems, and advocates should work together to ensure that non-degree credential programs and policies don't create separate tracks for learners of color or promote a jobs first mentality. Quality non-degree credentials can expand access to post-secondary attainment, especially when embedded in larger stackable credential strategies with comprehensive credit for prior learning policies. High quality short-term programs should be the first step for someone on an educational pathway. On the next slide, you'll see the core components of why we need a comprehensive approach. Quality non-degree credentials are an important component of an inclusive economic recovery, as Janine mentioned, particularly in light of the pandemic's disproportionate impact on communities of color and workers facing low wages. But non-degree credentials are not islands unto themselves. They're a part of a larger ecosystem. And if that ecosystem flourishes through robust quality assurance frameworks and thoughtful state and federal policies, then non-degree credentials can fulfill their potential and connect more people to better education and employment pathways. If not, we could continue to see segregated education opportunities that exclude people of color from lucrative opportunities and continue to drive economic inequity. Non-degree credentials are also a key component of state post-secondary attainment goals and a means to help workers get better jobs and reconnect them to further education and training opportunities, particularly working adults. And lastly, credential transparency is critical to helping workers know if skills training they pursue will help them achieve their employment and learning goals. So identifying and incentivizing high-value non-degree credentials can and should be part of an economic recovery strategy. So how do you start? On the next slide, you will see how National Skills Coalition, through feedback from leading states, has developed a consensus criteria for defining non-degree credentials to ensure equitable access and attainment so that working adults know which skills training programs offer the quality credentials to meet their career goals. This criteria includes 4 components. There must be evidence of substantial job opportunities related to a credential, and employers must confirm that the credential is used in the hiring, retention, or promotion decisions. I want to emphasize this point. The voices of small and mid-sized businesses is necessary in this work. There should also be evidence that competencies are mastered by credential holders. Here, the seat time or clock time of a training program is not as important as if the individual can demonstrate the skills needed to do the job associated with the credential. Next, information about credentials, including their employment and earnings outcomes, need to be available. And whenever possible, outcomes should be disaggregated by race, ethnicity, gender, and other characteristics that can help identify equity gaps so that we can address them in a timely manner. And lastly, as I've mentioned, non-degree credentials are just one step along a career pathway, and we should support whenever possible that non-degree credentials are embedded in and articulate to additional education and training opportunities. As states implement these criteria, as you'll see on the next slide, especially to support an inclusive economic recovery, they use their quality non-degree credential lists in many ways. Some states use their credentialing lists to align performance accountability, like under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act and Perkins approved training programs. Haley, do you want to flip to the next slide? New Jersey, for example, has adopted a quality assurance framework for the eligible training provider list using 5 dimensions: labor market demand, employment and wage outcomes, education outcomes, financial impact, and equity. This framework will guide which training providers and programs remain on the state's ETPL. New Jersey is also incorporating credential transparency efforts with a goal to reach residents that don't use the state workforce development system. Quality non-degree credential lists are also helping to determine where limited state and federal workforce training resources should be invested. In response to the workforce challenges caused by the pandemic, the South Dakota Board of Technical Education developed Upskill, a set of online short-term certificates in high-demand fields available to dislocated workers eligible for reemployment assistance. These programs, funded by a combination of Federal CARES Act, WIOA Title I monies, use National Skills Coalition's quality criteria to evaluate the list of programs that would be offered, opportunities to grow skills and in-demand jobs needed by businesses, gain additional credentials, and pursue educational goals as credit in these short-term programs integrate with Associate of Applied Science or bachelor's degree programs at public institutions throughout the state. And lastly, quality definitions assist in the development of new policies that support the equitable credential attainment of residents to achieve state post-secondary attainment goals. We'll soon hear from a panelist in Louisiana on how their quality definitions will support state goals. As you can see by this slide, National Skills Coalition has worked with many states over the last year and a half as they have developed, codified, and started to create policies to support access, attainment, and measurement of quality non-degree credentials. With support from the Lumina Foundation, we will hold our second cohort of states in a Quality Post-Secondary Credentials Policy Academy this fall. And thanks to what we've learned by working with states like Colorado and Oregon, we will be providing state technical assistance to create external advisory committees to help cross-state agency teams inform equitable access and attainment policies for quality non-degree credentials. These committees are intended to include community-based organizations serving Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and other organizations representing workers. Today, you'll hear from 3 states who are at the forefront of defining quality credentials, and you'll hear the best practices and challenges surrounding this work. You'll also hear about the important role that advocates can play in the work happening in states. Later this month, we will announce the states who have been selected for our next 15-month Policy Academy. And we look forward to working with state advocates like yourselves who can bring the voices and lived experiences of the communities that you serve to inform quality credentialing policies within your state. So to begin our discussion, I'd like to introduce our first 2 panelists. And on the next slide, you will see their names, titles, and organizations. We're excited to have with us Randy Stamper, the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Career Pathways and Workforce Programs at the Virginia Community College System. The Virginia Community College System has a well-known G3 workforce initiative and a training program called Fast Forward that supports adult workers in obtaining credentials in short-term in-demand jobs. Most programs take between 6 and 12 weeks. They're flexible so students can get their education while they work, and the program has a 90% completion rate. We're also joined by Kim Kirkpatrick, who is the Associate Commissioner for Institutional Research and Performance Assessment Services for the Louisiana Board of Regents. In September of last year, the Board of Regents approved a quality credentials of value policy to identify non-degree or non-academic credentials that provide value in the marketplace, leading to strong opportunities and good wages, with a goal to increase enrollment and eliminate the state's equity gaps. For the next 15 minutes, I'll be in conversation with both Randy and Kim, and then we'll pose to Randy and Kim some questions about the policies and rulemaking that they'll be pursuing in their state to advance what we know around quality non-degree credentials. And so Randy, I'd love to start with you and have you tell us about the Virginia G3 initiative and the Fast Forward program, particularly how it focuses on quality non-degree credentials and works to ensure equitable access and attainment.
Sure, thank you, Rachel. And thank you to everybody at National Skills Coalition. Really appreciate this opportunity. And thank you to the guests who have joined us. So I'll give a quick background on Fast Forward and then talk about how that rolled into G3. So back in 2015, when the National Skills Coalition was doing such a fantastic job of highlighting the skills gap, middle skills gap, we worked with them to come up with some data that was Virginia specific that we could take to our legislators and say, in Virginia, there was no significant state investment in non-credit workforce programming. It was all credit-based FTE programming. And with the help of NSC, we were able to make the case that we were missing the boat on a lot of these industry credentials that had value in the marketplace to employers that simply weren't being invested in. And the result of that was a first-time investment ever in Virginia in non-credit workforce programming from the State General Assembly and with a state budget line item. The law is called the New Economy Workforce Credential Act, which doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. So we branded it with our community colleges as Fast Forward. As Rachel said, they're short-term, 6 to 12 weeks. It is a pay-for-performance model. So the way it works is when the student walks in or signs up for a class, they have to pay 1/3 of the cost of that program. And there is some limited state financial aid available to individuals to cover that first third if they cannot. Once they complete the course, the state pays the college the second third of the total cost of the program. And then the key piece is the student has to earn an industry credential and provide evidence of that industry credential for the college to be made whole for the third. If the credential is not earned or not substantiated, the college is out on the third. So everybody has a little skin in the game. It has resulted in a pretty significant growth of appropriate non-credit workforce training program being moved out of semester-based FTE approaches and into what I believe is the rightful place for many of these programs in more flexible delivery methods, accelerated delivery methods, and the success has been pretty significant. We launched in July of 2016. To date, we have awarded about 30,000 of these credentials. We do some data matching with our employment commission so that we can track wages. So we look at the wages of the individuals who are in the program 1 year before and then 1 year after completing. So over roughly 5 years now, average wage increase for these individuals has been $8,000, which represents about 37%. In some cases, in about a quarter of the outcomes, the wage increases have been upwards of 85%. So we're very stringent in how we choose the programs that we're going to invest what is relatively limited state resources into. So at the same time that this legal lobbying was going on, the VCCS was also launching its 6-year strategic plan, which was called Achieve 2021. And that plan was a single sentence, that we would triple the number of credentials that our colleges awarded by 2021. We didn't quite hit that goal, but we made a massive dent. In order to be able to count, how we're increasing credentials, obviously we included associate's degrees and certificate programs and diplomas, but we worked closely with an SC to come up with some criteria, and many of which Rachel touched on, right? They have to be competency based. They have to be third-party issued. These are not credentials we create and put into the hands of people. It's state licenses, things like the American Welding Society, those sorts of things. They have to be portable. They have to be able to be aligned for. So when people come back and want to continue their journey, they're not starting over in a similar class that just happens to be on the credit side. And so those are the credentials that counted toward Achieve 2021. Okay, so that's how we define quality credentials. Then in a subset of those for Fast Forward had an even higher bar. So the colleges, if they wanted to be approved, had to submit a proposal package that ultimately went to our state board, had to include regional specific labor market information for the college's service region on growth of employment in the occupations that are aligned to those credentials. And the package had to include specific and concrete commitments by businesses in their area to, one, endorse the credential, endorse the program, and have some sort of what's next, guaranteed interviews, work-based learning opportunities, those sorts of things. So if the whole environment of quality credentials in Virginia are about 600 credentials that meet those first 5 criteria, Fast Forward we're investing in only about 170 that have this higher level of expectation for employment, for wage outcomes, those sorts of things. And I'll sum up here real quickly, Rachel. We didn't know when we started this if we would simply be robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? If we're just going to move credit students from over here to non-credit programs over here. We felt deeply and had some research that it was not going to be that way, and that's been the case. So of those 30,000 credentials, the students who are receiving them, average age is 35. Over 40% of the credential earners come from communities of color. They are twice as likely to have received SNAP or TANF benefits before enrollment, and 60% have dependents. So these are the folks who, if you're familiar with the United Way Alice report, these are the folks who are working, they're above the federal poverty line, but they're not making ends meet. They're working really hard to take care of themselves and their families, but they're not in jobs that are giving them a pathway to middle class and beyond. So we hit the mark on that. And as Rachel said, our course completion rates are above 90%. They're about 92% in our latest report. Credential completion is lower, and we knew it would be, but we started in the first year at about 60%. We're up to about 75% credential completion now. And that now has rolled into what is Virginia's version of a college promise program, which is G3. It was our governor's premier workforce plank in his campaign, and it includes many of these Fast Forward credentials, but then also provides funding for tuition, fees, books, and in some cases, living expenses for certain means eligible individuals to enroll in approved programs in the 5 high demand areas in Virginia, which are IT, healthcare, skilled trades, manufacturing, early childhood education, and public safety. So we really feel that we were successful in getting the larger G3 Promise program passed because of everything we did with Fast Forward as far as programmatic design, really robust data tracking, being able to show the actual outcomes from reliable data. and then making the case that this was a new student, right? These folks, through 75% of these folks had never stepped onto one of our college campuses. So we really were targeting a new and highly important segment of folks in Virginia to get them, in an improved place in the economy. I'll stop there, Rachel.
Thanks, Randy. We were so grateful to have Virginia be a part of our last Policy Academy cohort. And I know that you really shared your approach, not only to building programs, but the policies that are needed to support adult workers in attaining these credentials and getting on a career pathway. Could you spend a couple more minutes and tell the audience really about how the Virginia Community College system really approaches supporting adult learners in accessing and completing non-degree credentials?
Sure, yeah. We dedicated a fair amount of WIOA leadership funds at the beginning of Fast Forward to ensure that there were dedicated career coaches specifically for these students who, as I said, many of them have kids, they're working jobs, they needed, flexibility. And we know that, the reason for dropouts in Virginia, and I'm sure this is true nationwide, more often than not are non-academic, right? Some of our colleges look at their dropouts and the GPAs are 2.8, 3.0. It's life stuff, it's other things that get in the way. So we invested heavily in career coaches who work directly with these students, help them find community resources, help them find transportation, childcare, all of those things. And then more recently, we have implemented at every one of the colleges the Single Stop platform, which, if you don't know, Single Stop is an online platform that is tailored to state. Actually, it's tailored to regions, and it takes information from students and lets them know all of the federal, state, public, private benefits that are available to them. And in just about the last 12 months, we've connected students, many of them Fast Forward students, to over $2 million in benefits that they wouldn't have otherwise known that they were eligible for. And then, those I guess are a little bit more programmatic from a policy standpoint. Our new strategic plan, which just took effect in July, is centered solely on equity and is very well aligned with what National Skills Coalition is doing, the Lumina Foundation. And we are going through our entire policy manual, our entire onboarding process, and we are identifying policies that may have had good reason to be there when they were passed 25 years ago, but that actually restrict access. And we're doing a lot of work with our state board to overhaul our policy framework, and then also to overhaul the way that we integrate students and the way we work with students, so that the momentum is our responsibility, not the student's responsibility. One specific example is we had a policy on the books that an associate's degree, no more than 25% of an associate's degree could be awarded credit for prior learning. We changed that and made it allowable for 75% of the degree to be based on credit for prior learning. So that's just a couple of examples.
Thank you so much. I want to bring Kim into this conversation. Louisiana also represents a state who participated in our previous Policy Academy. And Kim, I'd like to really ask you about how the Louisiana Board of Regents really approached this work. As I mentioned last fall, you adopted a quality post-secondary credential of value policy. Tell us about how you approached your definition as a way to support your state's post-secondary attainment goals.
Sure. And I also want to thank National Skills Coalition for all of their help. I jotted down about the Policy Academy for 2020, 2021. And for those of you who will be in future cohorts, don't think it takes a year to get through this. We plan certainly to continue to network going forward. Everything that I just heard, I would like to be there in 2 or 3 years because I see a vision. But to get back to how we started, in the past, much like Virginia and other states, our academic programs went through a review process. They came to the Board of Regents, they got board approval, they had recommendations, they had different requirements that needed to be met, and we collected data on them. On the non-credit side, this was not the case. We largely, they were in different student systems. If even in student systems, we didn't have demographic information, we didn't know if there was equity, there was just a whole lot of unknowns out there. So when we developed the policy, it was to address the things you said, to utilize what the our Louisiana Economic Development Group does, in addition with our workforce group, which is identify 3, 4, and 5-star jobs, much like what you indicated. Each little star is openings, wages, growth, all those opportunities. So they did that designation for us, but it was on the occupational side. Those went to the regional economic development organizations for priority and regional, basically, as was mentioned, buy-in by business and industry to say that we do support that these kind of jobs need to be filled, and these are the kind of programs that we look for to get students into these jobs. So the policy basically says that it must be aligned to that. There is a tie to employment outcomes. I wish I could be able to say everything that the gentleman from Virginia said, because I want to be able to prove those very things. It's tied to what right now it's supposed to be 20% above what a high school student would earn, and revisited that we want the same stackability, the same option to be able to feed into continuing their education, just not a standalone, this is your dead end, all you're ever going to be. So it does comprise all of those factors, and I can tell you that we never ever had problem from the buy-in of people from the top, our commissioner, our legislators. That was never one of our obstacles, is that people didn't think that these don't have value, because they certainly do. The problem was showing that value, quantifying that value. Legislators, when they give money, they want to see the outputs of this. So they were very much involved in setting up these dollars and funds that can be used for non-credit. We started with a Reboot Louisiana, which was kind of the first earmarked dollars for this kinds of training. Right now we have the MJ Foster or Michael Foster Promise, which also allows for non-credit. And this is the first this has been allowed in our state, and a large part of it was because we had these things in policy, we had these things in practice that says this is what we're talking about, and this is how the programs we're going to go about developing them. And so, as with most, it's not through our funding formula, but there are dollars associated with it, which definitely gets players to work more closely together. We want to be able to prove that this all works, and be able to show, I really liked the transparency to students, to the citizens, to the business and industry, just the transparency that these are valid credentials, that it's justifiably so to have them in your statewide attainment goals, because that wasn't a part before, even though we know that they add value to the workforce.
Thanks, Kim. Louisiana, in my mind, took a really innovative approach to the definition of your credentials of value policy, because you also define something called on-ramp credentials. Tell us about why creating and recognizing an on-ramp credential definition was so important to the work that your cross-agency and cross-system team worked on last year.
Certainly. Well, one of the things that was very important to all the parties involved was that it wasn't a binary, you're on the list, you're not on the list, because the wage for the 3, 4, 5 star determination is, that is one of the factors. And so there are definite CNAs or there's quite on-ramp, nice, an opening to those entry-level positions that do lend themselves to go on to something that could be a credential of value if you wanted that, or if it's just of value, it's an on-ramp to you because you want to be in the service industry or early childhood or whatever, and it may not have made the cut for the other criteria. So it wasn't a you're in, you're out, implying that if you that if you doing something else, that's not of value. So it was very important to include that in the policy.
And Kim, I think that really speaks to that recognition of where, adult learners and adult workers and just people are in the process of connecting to skills training and career pathways. We really, I think, expect as we continue our work with states that the model that you've created in creating on-ramp credentials will be one that other states look at. I'd like to open up the conversation now to both Kim and Randy, and I'm really curious to know, what additional policies are you considering pursuing at the state level to support and expand access to quality non-degree credentials? Randy, you can start with that question. And Kim, I want you to dive a little bit deeper into some new data requirements that you'll be taking in Louisiana. As a data person myself, this work is quite of interest to me, but we'll start with Randy. Tell us what else you're looking forward to in Virginia to really expand access to quality non-degree credentials.
Sure, happy to. Several years ago, our General Assembly has a wing that's kind of its watchdog group. It's called JLARC, and I won't bore you with what that stands for, but if you work in state government in Virginia, you have butterflies when you hear you're getting JLARC'd, and we got JLARC'd a few years back. And one of the findings that they put out there, or recommendations, I guess, is that our student to advisor ratio was roughly 800 to 1. Which is just ridiculous. You generally want to, shoot for about 300 to 1. So, we use that as a bargaining chip to state that we need more bodies serving students. And we were able to get an appropriation just this past year to expand with, it's only 60, but to expand with 60 more coaches and advisors. And we're going to continue to try to grow that because, we went through the Hope survey of our students, and we know that 40% are dealing with hunger issues, 17% are homeless. We've got mental health issues, particularly compounded by COVID. So we are pursuing a variety of policies around mental health and non-academic supports. At our last board meeting, we changed our state policy, which for years has said that our colleges basically do not enter the mental health realm. We don't do referrals. We simply do not provide mental health. Our board changed that policy just 2 weeks ago to allow our colleges to contract with third-party providers to provide mental health supports to our students. And we're going to put the RFP out and try to provide more student-centered focus on that sort of thing. I mentioned earlier that our new strategic plan is focused solely on equity, and a big part of that is not so much policy development, I think, as what will probably be over the next couple of years, policy elimination. We have some policy on the books about returning citizens and what kind of programs they can be in and what kind of programs they can't be in. And Virginia is not a ban the box state, so I think that there are some intrinsic barriers that keep people from accessing financial aid, if not just simple enrollment, that we need to address. So we definitely are looking at adding policies that help us be more responsive, but I think our sweet spot in the short term is going to be what kind of policies have been on the books for 20, 30, 40 years that are no longer tenable.
Kim, jump in here on the work that the Board of Regents in Louisiana has done in pursuing rulemaking around proprietary training providers.
So you mentioned that you're a data person, as am I. So this is, as we all know, the devil is in the details. Everything sounds really good. We, of course, want information on proprietary schools. In the past, those items were collected in a survey form during the renewal process. You can't slice up what's in boxes. The programmatic, the zip codes were not assigned, there were degree levels were not defined. So we have started the process with basically coming up with a non-credit or inventory or program inventory to collect these kinds of information. I can tell you we're kind of struggling with the stackability of the non-credit credentials. You know, we have this on-ramp to credentials of value, but the stackability for some of the proprietary schools that don't really have that mindset may be more challenging and difficult because they haven't really thought of this. And so we are going to start with a program inventory to identify those programs. As I mentioned, there is a scholarship opportunity for certain programs to be on that list. And so the data will have to be reported to us. We will be collecting its student level enrollment data as well as completion level data. We're in the works of another MOU, a modified memorandum of understanding between our Office of Student Financial Aid and our Workforce Commission. The link being obviously that if you want the scholarship, then you're going to have to report the data at the student level, and that you will be subject to employment outcomes to be provided annually or you know, this was a lot of money that was put forth. But we don't just want the data for the scholarship. If this scholarship goes away, we still want to be able to capture the data, capture the programs across the state, credit, non-credit, whatever, and to be able to collect enrollments and completions on these. So file specifications have been modified, common data definitions have been defined, are in the process of being defined. And the rulemaking that you referred to is that now, instead of just the summary at renewal process, it will have to be a student level file submission submitted, of course, securely to our to our IT section. And that is going to prove quite challenging. But we have a large group of people that are committed to making it happen. And so we really do hope that through this process of rulemaking, approved through the boards, that they get this data through, so we'll have a much more holistic view of the students that we enroll. And of course, with file specifications, we can say we want the race, we want the gender. Ideally, I want to know what parish they came from, because we have parishes, not counties. And so to be able to look at the regional aspect of this is very important. There's the northeast part of our state is very different from the New Orleans region, from the Southwest. You know, we all have the different challenges. So I think it's going to be an important thing to collect is where are these workers coming from for regional planning purposes, and then of course tracking them into the workforce. One of the things about the scholarship is that the student has to agree to stay on and work in the state for a year. So we obviously want to be able to ensure or check to see if that is in fact happening. You know, if the development of the programs are in line with the workforce demands of our state, then we'd like to see that they're filling the jobs in our state. And you know, those definitely vary by the different labor market regions.
Thank you, Kim, for providing that context. I know your estate, as well as others in our Policy Academy, who took the approach of really engaging training providers in why their submission of student level data for the completion of outcomes was so important, whether it's counting those quality credentials towards the state post-secondary attainment goal, or just being able to disaggregate those outcomes, as you mentioned, by race, gender, or geographic location to determine gaps. So I really commend you on taking that robust approach around data and recognizing that you don't have all of the information that you need to really talk about this. I now want to just transition a little bit and bring in another voice in our conversation. As I mentioned, skills training advocates play an important and necessary role in the work that states are doing to define quality. But you don't have to take my word for it. I'm happy to bring into the conversation Shar Robert, the legislative director at the Colorado Center on Law and Policy, which serves as the lead organization for Colorado's SkillSpan Coalition. Shar holds kind of a unique role amongst the states that we worked with in our previous policy academy, in that she served on the Colorado team that helped to adopt a consensus definition of quality non-degree credentials. And Shar, I would love for you to really speak to the role that advocates have in supporting credential quality efforts and access and attainment policies. And especially would like you to share any advice that you have for advocates who might be called upon in the next 15 months as we continue our work among states to work with cross-agency state teams.
Thank you, Rachel. So I did not join the Colorado initiative on credentials because I was an expert on short-term credentials. Let me make that very clear. I joined to learn about short-term credentials. But as I attended the different meetings, I tried to pinpoint why I felt such a disconnect between the policy work that Skills to Compete Colorado was doing and the discussion that I was listening to. When I look at our members of our Colorado coalition, many of our members are working with adults on TANF, adults in SNAP employment and training, those who were returning after incarceration, refugees, immigrants, people without a high school diploma, people who have disabilities or who've experienced homelessness or addiction. And it seemed to me that what had been missing, when I looked at the discussion of credentials, the path to the starting line for this work seemed really murky. And so for us, a critical question in the discussion was, what are the prerequisites to begin this work? We often talk at Skills to Compete about the pathway to the career pathway. A lot of the member organizations are working with participants who don't have a high school diploma, almost half. And so that really was like the lens I brought, was that it's really important to figure out, you know, how big a gap there is between the folks who are doing the job seeking and the starting line, or what Kim referred to as on-ramp credentials. We were glad to discover that word. In terms of advice for others who aren't state, every other person on the task force other than NSC was a state employee. And in terms of advocating for quality credentials, back when WIOA passed in 2015, my organization put out a study called Surviving to Thriving, which did focus groups with low-income women to try to figure out what were the barriers to skills training they were experiencing. And one very surprising result that we weren't expecting was that many of them had skills training, but they were low-income women. And part of this was that they had gone through some kind of training and it did not lead to a job change. It didn't lead to any income increase. It just led to a lot of debt. A lot were graduates of private occupational schools, and they may have used up their Pell eligibility. And people need some kind of guidance in terms of where to start career work, especially when you're seeking work that's outside of your existing social network, when you don't know people who are already working in that field, people are seeking training to increase their income or to qualify for a job. And I really appreciated the move towards the short-term credentials and the stackability, because sometimes the contemplation of a long period of time is a little much to handle, and the bite-sized chunks really that can build on each other really make a difference.
Thank you, Shar. So one thing that really resonated with me in your comments that I think are helpful for advocates who are a part of our session today is the fact that you don't have to be an expert, just that willingness to want to learn more about short-term credentialing policies and how to define quality. But I think what you really brought to the Colorado team meetings, and I know that, you know, I was certainly a part of those, was a voice that sometimes wasn't represented in the state agency staff there, like the necessity, as you said, to identify eligibility requirements that are needed to even access these training opportunities, and how critical that is when you're supporting adults who have systemic barriers like justice involvement. I know this is one of the reasons that we really wanted to pursue the creation of external advisory committees in our upcoming Policy Academy cohort, so that we can really have a more you know, organized and really critically centered advocacy voice in the conversation that state teams are having around these definitions and subsequent policies. This is a question maybe that we hadn't planned for, Shar, but I'm just kind of curious. I'm sure you have many policy wishes on your list. Is there something that maybe you're working on within, you know, the SkillSpan Coalition in Colorado around short-term credentialing that you would just like to share as, like, this is kind of a passion, a big win, and an area that you're looking to pursue coming up? Just happy if you could share a few words about what's next in your work.
Well, this past year, we worked on getting more state funding for SNAP employment and training. That probably isn't groundbreaking among other states, but Colorado is notoriously cheap because of our prohibition on our elected officials can't increase taxes. We're kind of unique in that way. Our workforce system until this past year has run almost entirely on federal dollars. And so federal policies go with that. Big picture, one of the things we are working on is recognizing that workforce development, and especially digital equity, those issues live in many different state agencies. And so even though our higher ed system and our Department of Labor are who most people think about in terms of workforce, part of the role that we play at Skills to Compete is to really connect all of the different places where workforce development is going on. A lot of times it's almost a siloing, where the folks that many of our members work with are connected to the Department of Human Services, both through childcare or through transitional jobs or through SNAP employment and training or through TANF. And then our adult ed programs are in our Department of Education, which focuses on K-12. So they're kind of a stepchild. The Department of Corrections actually does skills training. And then in terms of the digital equity work, we are working hard. We have a colleague of mine who chairs the policy committee for Digital Inclusion Committee. With all the money pouring in for building out broadband, we are very concerned that whole effort including people who don't have access to devices, can't afford the connection, who are very nervous and intimidated by technology, who are suspicious of technology. And so we're doing a lot of work on digital equity, and in like trying to get the state agents, support state agencies interacting with each other, as well as one of the earlier speakers mentioned, we have a lot of community-based organizations who it's almost a trickle-down effect of they might get some dollars, you know, when all of the money finishes flowing, or they might not because they don't have good enough grant writers, or because the state systems don't know about them. And yet they're the ones where the clients have been going to them often, not just for workforce, but also just to get food in a pandemic, to get devices when they needed one and didn't have one when things closed down, that kind of thing.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that. You know, it really comes back for me to this idea that all of this work we're doing is really within an ecosystem that supports other components of the work. And to be able to bring those pieces forward in a way that really helps, again, to support working adults who need those pathways to upskilling and reskilling with, you know, career pathway opportunities, so that they can be successful in their communities. I'm going to turn this over to Janine for a few minutes here of questions. We really would like to hear from audience members. Feel free to ask a question in chat, or if you'd like to raise your virtual hand, we can call on you to ask questions of Randy, Kim, Shar. Bring forward what's coming up for you as you listen to this conversation. And of course, we have a couple of questions in our back pocket that we can ask our panelists as well. So Janine.
Great, thanks Rachel, and thanks Shar and Kim and Randy. This has been really informative, and it's really great to hear how you're working across different agencies and with different stakeholders throughout your states to really have these programs make a difference for a range of folks in your communities, and really trying to center equity in all of that. So I am not seeing any questions or hands raised at this time. I am thinking that I'd love to just hear from all of you about if you had to lift up just one success, something that you feel like has really made a difference, both in terms of the work that's happening in your state, but maybe also in your career. We were talking a little bit earlier with Kim about the duration, the length that some of us have been in this field, and just the impact that that's had on how we feel progress is or isn't being made. And so it would be great if, Kim, I'm going to actually just turn it over to you to just share a little bit about a success that you would lift up.
Well, I started off in the community and technical college system. This has been something that that particularly those schools who started off as vocational technical program campuses, eventually they have merged in to be comprehensive either technical community colleges or community technical colleges, and really try to embrace all that offers to the students and to the citizens of our state. So I think that our system president, our community and technical college system president, has done a really good job of regionalizing the data needs, getting this out in the forefront to all of the stakeholders. Like I mentioned before, we didn't have a problem selling this to legislators. They very much knew that not everybody was on a track of a traditional four-year school. The MJ Foster Promise Scholarship is another huge success, obviously not for me personally, but for them. He was considered the father of the community and technical college system. He started that system in 1998. So this was a very much great tribute to all that he wanted to accomplish in our state, which is that, certainly there are traditional two-year school feeders that do a lot of 2+2 programs with our four-year schools, but that's not everybody's goal. And the traditional IPEDS graduation rate, for instance, not a good indication of success for a community college, because they don't all come in, wanting to complete the associate's degree. So I think it's going to be great to be able to show how is this information closing the gaps of what we didn't know, just what we didn't know. I mean, we have MOUs with our Department of Education, we have MOUs with our Workforce Commission, and this is just another way to make that ecosystem whole, and have the different options available to the students. And like I've mentioned before, the transparency of that information. We also, if I didn't remember to recognize them, a phenomenal Student Financial Aid Office, LOSFA is our Louisiana Office of Student Financial Aid, tremendous outreach they do for not only our TOPS program, but the TOPS Tech program, which did attempt to get to these technical programs, although we didn't get the participation rates. I think Shar mentioned just you still needed to take an ACT, or just there was barriers to be able to participate. And so focusing on, a grant that can say, oh, these are for the adults, these are for the some college no degree, or these are for the no college, has been a tremendous momentum in our state and recognition in our state. And I just hope to be able to get the data. Randy, I would love to be able to spout out the percentages that you're able to do to say this percent were no college, and this percent were this, and this percent, have these benefits. That's like something that would really help. Our commissioner has on our website, not just tracking completion goals, but a prosperity index, because our state, it's about prosperity, and what does that mean in our state, from not just post-secondary, but the other factors. And so it's really a holistic approach that our master plan looks at, which was, a good starting point for the recognition of these kinds of credentials and these kinds of awards and the students we serve, and from foster youth to incarcerated to whatever. The outreach is just not that traditional high school senior, did you graduate, did you go to college within a year? There's a whole lot of other people out there, both in and not in the workforce, that we needed to address.
Kim, I will be happy
Kim.
to put you into contact with my peer who handles all of our data and is the person who's responsible for me being able to spout that off.
Todd Massa?
Great. No, Todd's at Chev, but Todd helps. No, Kat Finnegan, and
Okay.
she's extraordinarily good.
Well, I
That's great.
welcome that. These kinds of things I mentioned before, they're not whenever I'm in a cohort or the opportunity to participate in this kind of policy, it's more about the networking and the continued, it certainly doesn't take just a year to complete anything, but the continued network, the continued outreach, and being able to tap on what other people did or didn't do well, or, hey, how did you get across this barrier that we don't seem
Right.
to be able to get past? So
Right.
very much appreciate that.
Right. Thank you, Kim. So Randy, we do have a question here for you about how it was that Virginia made the decision to move forward with the pay for performance model. And folks want to know a little bit more about that. If you could just describe it and then say a little bit about how it works.
Sure. So, that was part of the sausage making. That was not what we proposed when we put our proposal into the General Assembly. But at that time, our General Assembly was Republican controlled. We had a Democratic governor, and horse trading being what it was, there was an interest in making sure that this wasn't just a big allocation of money that went off into the community college world and never really got reported on. And I'm fine with that, to be honest with you. We had some real trepidation about how that student first third was going to work, but it's been fairly successful. So I'll give you a concrete example. Prior to Fast Forward, if you wanted to go to a community college and train to take your CDL, commercial driver's license, on day one, you had to write a check or put it on your credit card, $4,500 right out of the gate. So what this does is the state will fund up to $3,000 for the second and third thirds, right? And the student needs to come up with that first third. Now, that being said, we have many students who $1,500 is just the same barrier as $4,500. So we have a financial aid program, state-funded financial aid program, because Pell can't support these programs, right? That will cover all of that first third for individuals who are 200% of poverty or below, except in certain pockets of the state. There's a sliding scale because of cost of living. And that's been really effective. We have a lot of students who don't pay anything. But the college is still responsible. They've got to get them through successfully the course to get the second third of the funding, and they've got to get the credential and be able to prove it for the third third. Now, part of that we do at the state level through data sharing agreements with our Board of Nursing and our Department of Occupational and Professional Regulation. But a lot of it happens at the college level with, those coaches are really important in maintaining that relationship with the students. So when they leave our campus to go take the test or, the skills test or the driving test, that we get that information back.
Super, that's really helpful. And speaking of information, there's a question here about how it is that if and how any of your states are looking at the line of sight between the knowledge and skills or the competencies that students are obtaining, and then how those specific competencies might be impacting their retention and their just success in the labor market. Could any of you share anything that your state's doing to kind of connect those dots there?
I can share a couple sentences. I'm not the data expert either, but I did talk to our data expert about the follow-up, and Colorado will be folding in some of these credential tracking into our eligible provider training list system. So they'll be collecting the same data that WIOA requires from other programs, and then hoping to add some apprenticeship data to that later when they can work out the data sharing. But it would be similar to what we're collecting, all the WIOA outcome measures, just like other programs. And Colorado does do I think it's annual talent pipeline report, which counts the number of degrees. I don't think they've gotten to credentials yet, but I think that might be in the future. And then job openings, so that there's more of a match between where the jobs are going to be open and where we should focus getting more people, encouraging more people to pursue that degree.
And Janine,
Thanks,
I'd love to add a little something to this question, and I mentioned it as being a real critical, important part of the work that states do in defining quality, is to really ensure that that employer, the economic development, the Chamber of Commerce has a voice at this table in talking about their specific skills training needs. And I think where we have seen good success among states is where that voice is a part of the state team who is developing these quality criteria and adoption, with that real clear recognition that there's a role for employers to play as well in ensuring the talent pipeline is being met. And I do recognize that we are coming very close to the end of our time together today. I do want to thank the panelists for not only, you know, sharing your words of wisdom, your expertise, but really the participation that you have played within your states over the last year and a half in our work on Equality Post-Secondary Credentials Policy Academy. I suspect we will continue to be in touch with all of you and really share the expertise and the innovation that you've taken in your states with a new cohort of states who will be doing this work. And thanks to all of you who are attending today. This is, of course, just the first day of our Skills in the States Forum. And this concludes our programming for Skills in the States today. We hope that you will join us again tomorrow. The opening plenary session will begin at 12 noon Eastern Time. And I also want to make sure that I mentioned this. I'm putting it in the chat. Please also consider joining us this afternoon for a fireside chat with NSC's Executive Director, Andy Van Clunen, in conversation with the Secretary of Commerce. You can register via the link that I've dropped into the chat and listen in on what will be an incredible conversation, I'm sure, later this afternoon. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Rachel. Great job.